Putin starts off with a detailed historical account. Why? Besides suggesting the obvious, that Russia has historical claims to certain Ukrainian territories, highlighting the complex and multifaceted history of the region and its deep-rooted connections to it. Was there more to this than meets the eye? You bet there was. In short, our study of every major message that has come out of the Russian Federation in the last 2 decades from Putin and his officials attests to the fact that they like to convey rationality amidst hostile adversity. This is done by appearing to follow strict principles and values based on elements of both international and natural laws. This is a solid strategy which makes it difficult to contend against, as such arguments tend to be well received among the international order. It was fascinating and rather dumbfounding to Tucker that such an emphasis was placed on ensuring the historical narrative of the Russian nation's past was clearly heard. Even he admitted at the start that his initial reaction was it being filibuster, but then believed he understood the context. In short, Tucker either sadly didn't understand a damn thing or he was deliberately quiet about making wild predictions, which could jeopardize his position with both sides. First of all, it is a tactic often used to anesthetize public perception. Quite simply, this was a deliberate action by Putin, setting the foundation for the build-up to the ultimate message. In this case, he framed the context, which was ultimately that the offensive will stop at the Dnieper River, including the reconquest of Kiev, the sacred origin of the Russian nation. Yes, you read correctly. Kiev is back on the agenda, which could mean a bigger war with wider implications. Putin refrains from saying this directly, which is a key pattern in his speeches throughout the years. However, he still provides the answers if one wants to hear it. He even did the same when questioned by NBC's Keir Simmons in 2021 on whether he planned to attack Ukraine or not, only months before the actual invasion. There he stated that he has every right to hold exercises within Russian borders and does not pose a threat to Ukraine. However, he would frame the context once more by saying something interesting only a few sentences prior, that Ukraine is mobilizing an attack on Donbass. This was most fascinating to see, and it was at that very moment I knew we would have a conflict soon if the status quo continued. Well, we then get treated to another dimension, which was dealing with more recent history and offered a different lens. Putin mentions the negotiations in Istanbul. This was where the Ukrainians settled for a peace deal, with the US diplomats urging Russians to move out of Kiev in good faith so as to allow the Ukrainians some concessions to play with. As we know, Boris Johnson then whispered into Zelensky's ear and instructed him to scrap the deal. While this, to be honest, is only partially true, mainly due to the fact that the Russians also didn't want to sacrifice more people in Kiev, which would have been a nightmare to take at the time. Putin truly believed that he could have achieved a similar outcome as in Georgia, where autonomy would have been guaranteed in Donbass, and a favorable government soon replacing Zelensky, where clear opposition leaders such as Klitschko, Poroshenko, and Tymoshenko were ready to pounce and scrutinize the outcome. However, this is exactly what Boris Johnson was sent to stop from happening again. They were not going to let Putin come out of this one cheaply. This, in international politics, was a classic example of posturing in the shadows of diplomacy. However, in this case, it didn't work out so well for either side initially. But one thing the West and NATO failed to understand were their own capacity constraints to support Ukraine in a possible war of attrition, and Russia's natural ability to thrive in such warfare over an extended period of time. So, what can we conclude here? It's simple. The message was, we would have taken Kiev, but because we are the good guys, we didn't. But now that you wronged us, we will get our revenge. It really is that clinical. Otherwise, why mention it? Why not then mention the withdrawal from Kherson City, which was done in a similar fashion, and was negotiated with the Ukrainian side, or Kharkiv, or Izium and Lyman? Why only mention Kiev? Because Kiev is the sacred soul of Russia, and the Russian soul will never be at peace until it returns home, where it belongs. Putin then drove it home. He did this by ending the interview on the cultural and historical ties between Russians and Ukrainians. He framed the conflict as a civil war, and with emotional anecdotes that a larger battle to reunite people with a common heritage and identity was actually taking place. And most importantly, that it was a matter of time. until this happens. This was a truly thrilling moment on which the interview finished. If it were not for those last words which ostensibly came out of nowhere, the interview would have been a disappointment. Those last few minutes define this interview as a crucial moment in human history without exaggeration, even if we may not realize it now. Almost in epic poetry and sentimental fashion, Putin makes it clear that this was about the Russian soul and that nothing can divide it. If you know anything about the Russian people and their culture, the soul is terminology that is never used lightly. The Russians associate the soul with their identity as something mythical that has helped define them through millennia of struggle and quests to establish peace on their lands through eternal glory. This soul is defined by its quest and struggle for truth, which is seen as the ultimate source power. No amount of money or anything material can rival this in the eyes of the Russians. That is why this unique identity can find itself a sanctuary in ardent Russian nationalism, religious creed, or Marxism-Leninism. The only ideology it will never find itself in is foreign-imposed doctrines. That is why the West and NATO will continue to fail to impose colored revolutions in Russia. No matter how many Romanovs, Yeltsins, Berezovskys, Navalnys, or Pussy Riots they send, the Russian soul will never be able to find peace in a foreign body. That is why Kiev is where the Russian soul finds peace. That is where it was born, and therefore that is where it must return.